In a place as inhospitable as Antarctica, many ordinary men and women have risked and given their lives for one main objective: the advancement of science. Whether it has been their own personal aim or the aim of the governments of the countries they represent, the body of knowledge that has been opened up by these ice world pioneers is immense. And with climate change, most specifically global warming, and other environmental pressures on the increase, research in Antarctica is at a premium.
Scientists some time back now realised that if they really were going to be able to predict what happens to the climate in the future, you had to look at the planet as a whole. You had to look at all the physics and the chemistry and the biology. Otherwise you just were not going to get the right answers or not be able to predict accurately what was going to happen. And Antarctica is a very key component of that whole Earth system, of understanding the planet. Why? Well, just take a simple fact like 90% of the world's fresh water is tied up in Antarctica. So as the world warms, ice will melt, global sea level will rise, but that water is going to come from Antarctica. So we need to be able to predict on what time scale the ice will melt. Simple as that. The ocean around Antarctica couples to every other ocean in the world. If you think about the map of Antarctica, the oceans surrounding it, it couples to the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. And indeed, most of the cold, deep water that ventilates the rest of the world's oceans comes from Antarctica. So that's what the science is about, and Antarctica has a key role to play in that. Understanding how the planet works is vital for mankind.
The International Antarctica Treaty was signed in 1959 and established a unique collaboration between nations for continued research on that continent. For this research, a permanent presence was required on this most inhospitable of places. Scientists were housed in bases that needed to take them through severe adverse weather conditions. South Africa, as a founding signatory to the treaty, has had a permanent presence on Antarctica since 1960.
South Africa took over the Norwegian base in 1959-1960, and it was a very old timber structure that was eventually covered with snow and crushed. That was Sinai. They named it at that stage Sinai 1. About 8 years later they built another one, Sinai 2, and it also lasted about 8 years. And then they built Sinai 3, which was actually an attempt to weather the conditions by building large steel tubes, where they built the base inside, with the idea being that the ice would crush with time the outer shell.
I spent a couple of nights in Sinai 3, and the best description that I can think of offhand is that it's something like living in a submarine, or what I'd imagine living in a submarine.
Living under the ice is demanding. The ice is always trying to get into the base. There's always bits of the base being crushed just by the sheer weight of ice. So it's always a constant battle. It's relatively dark, no matter what you do with the lighting. It always seems a little bit dingy down there.
It was really somber at times because it's this dark at the bottom there. If the lights go out, it's pitch dark.
It was in bad shape. By then the base was about 14 years old and 24 to 25 meters under the surface. So that's an enormous amount of snow and ice on top of the base. Some of the bolts holding things together were busy breaking off, and the staircases leading into the base were all crooked. As you know, the construction is an Armco shell with containers inside, and the shell was basically collapsing from the top to the extent that it started pushing the containers in, so it was getting crushed.
With the aging South African base in a state of decay, and with a desire to ensure the continuity of research, the South African National Antarctic Program decided that a new base was needed. Leading structural engineer Henny Stassen was commissioned to design and oversee the building of that new base. After researching how people in icebound countries have dealt with temperatures well below freezing, and with the SANAP requirements in mind, Henny and his design team began to scout for appropriate locations to position such a base.
And about 150 kilometer inland, we visited all these peaks. We were looking for something more stable in the founding conditions, so you're not so dependent on the ice movements. So we needed a rocky outcrop somewhere. And we found the Vestes Karvet Nunatak, which means small flat mountain. And it was actually the ideal location. It was accessible. The base we wanted to position north-south because that was the smallest profile to the wind. The wind there is predominantly from the eastern side. So to do that, to try and minimize the work afterwards, we tried to place the base as close to the cliff edge. So any accumulation would in fact then just drop over the cliff and be cleaned out. The cliff is a 250 meter drop. We did a lot of wind tunnel tests and we built models, with different layouts and different, sharp corners, rounded corners. And we found that by curving these edges, we could at least reduce the drag on the structure by 30%. And then we generated a number of pictures, and eventually we had an artist's impression of what the base should look like, or what we think it should look like in the end.
A science capsule above the ice, with office space, an auroral lab to map the skies, and accommodation for a full overwintering team. A second capsule to house summer personnel, 80 of them, with kitchens, a gym, even a pub. And linked to the science capsule so that no one has to brave the elements on the way to work. Another link capsule for the diesel generators, 3 of them, as well as the sewage and water purification plants. Finally, a helipad with hangar space for 2 helicopters. All in all, over 1,400 tons of materials and equipment. Such an undertaking is enormous. Not just because of the size and scope of the actual construction, but because once the team has left Cape Town, they will be entirely alone. It is more than a 4,000 kilometer journey to Antarctica from Cape Town, so there is no option to return for some missing part or misplaced piece of equipment. Everything needed for that season's work must go down in one trip, correctly labeled, crated and stored. Because once they're in Antarctica, they may as well be on the moon. Two ships were used to take the stores and equipment, construction crews, scientists and other personnel down to Queen Maud Land, where the South African base is on the continent of Antarctica. The SAS Outeniqua, a South African naval ship with ice-breaking capabilities acquired from the Ukraine. And the SA Agulhas, a freight-carrying ice-strengthened ship.
The trip for me was a very important part of the experience. It was my first time at sea.
Well, if you can imagine putting 6 people plus their baggage into a 22-foot standard container, yeah, you can imagine it was a pretty chummy environment.
The two ships will be crossing some of the stormiest seas in the world. The notorious latitudes, 40 and 50 degrees south. Many ships have been lost in these waters.
Things change day by day. You leave Cape Town, pretty soon you move into the roaring 40s and the furious 50s.
And it's scary sometimes. The ship creaks or cracks like a wooden ship, and you hear all kinds of funny noises. It makes you quite aware that you're actually very small and bobbing up and down these immense 15-meter waves.
What happens is you sort of climb up the side of a swell and then go down and hammer straight into the next one, and you sort of stop dead still. The ship corkscrews a little bit and tries to get over the next one, and so it goes on.
And there were times we went through there that the ship was rolling at 40, 45 degrees.
The first icebergs are likely to appear between 50 and 60 degrees south.
It is quite mind-boggling when you look at this thing and you realize that this is just water, but it's like concrete, and it's actually made a little voyage of its own of a couple of thousand kilometers by then. If it's a berg which is carved off a really ancient piece of ice, or if it's a piece of ice that's been at the center of the glacier, which has really been subjected to intense pressure for thousands of years probably, the ice actually becomes a deep green, blue, almost a purple.
As the ships cross the Antarctic Circle at 66 degrees and 33 minutes south, the novices discover that it is not only when crossing the equator that one needs to honor the ancient creatures of the deep.
I don't know why we are here, sir. We are here because you dared to enter Neptune's realm without a license. You have no permission, no right to be here. Therefore, you will be punished.
So with crossing the Antarctic Circle, you get woken up one morning by King Neptune's bears to abate you to the king's wrath.
Well, I think it's an age-old tradition that's come a long way in terms of sailors that cross these lines, and I think similar things happen on the equator when you cross the equator. You have to give your respect to Neptune.
They summon you to the aft deck for the afternoon for a ceremony, and yeah, then it all begins.
And we all assembled on the back of the helideck then. Yes, sat Queen and King Neptune. They had a lot of buckets of cold water, seawater, and they had eggs and all kinds of mixtures. And they say, well, this is the ceremony, it's now time for you to be initiated. The big public works guys, they grabbed all of you, and you were in minimum clothes, and they pushed you into this bucket of cold seawater, which was sitting already at about, 5-6 degrees. You just felt yourself, everything just stiffen up and freeze. You thought, if this is +5, what's -25, And then they bundled you down and you had to kiss King Neptune's boot, and while you were doing it, they sort of crunched 5 eggs down the back and squashed them and covered you with mealie meal and baking powder and everything, and then you had to drink a mix, which still today, I don't know what was in there.
And in my case, I ended up with a head full of marine grease in my hair. It took me probably a week to clean up.
So that was my first experience of the Antarctic.
The Antarctic Circle ceremony to honor Neptune and his queen is also the harbinger of a complete change in seagoing conditions.
You go through an extremely quiet patch where the whole ocean is like a fish pond. There's no movement, it's beautiful, and it's just the ship breaking the ice.
It's a complete transition from high seas sailing. It's surreal. You just can't believe that there's that much ice around you. What's even odder is when you find that there are like massive icebergs that have actually frozen fast in the pack. It really is a landscape now, it's not a seascape anymore. You look at it and you feel, well, you could hop over and walk across.
This is the pack ice, and for all its beauty and serenity, it brings other hazards and concerns.
Once we went down at the end of October, and we were stuck in the ice for 20 days, going down. So, you could never really determine, even if you had satellite photographs, exactly how dense the pack ice was.
What would regularly happen is that they would ask the flying crews to fly out and to try and look, whether there are open passages. So the ship can steer towards the open passages and get through easier instead of trying to have to break through the thick ice.
And then eventually you see the white line on the horizon, from end to end as far as you can see, just a tiny little white line, and as you get closer it grows bigger and bigger. And yeah, it's immense, it's enormous, and that white line, and to see it growing as you get closer is quite something.
More than 15.5 million square kilometers of ice, with the ice sheet itself measuring on average around 1.5 kilometers thick. The South African team have a toehold on the north section of the continent, just west of Greenwich Mean Time and roughly 2,000 kilometers from the actual South Pole itself. From where they are docking, it is another 150 kilometers south to the new base site, the mountain Faceless Carpet.
Where the South African base is, this 150 kilometer inland site necessitated that we had to look at a modular system that can be built up like a Meccano set. Because the ice shelf was at that stage about 30 meters, we needed to offload everything by helicopter. So the packages had to be designed with a limit of about 2 tons.
The offloading of the ships is always a bit of a tense time for the ship and for the crews. A lot depended on the wind, and the ship would always try and steer in such a way that we were facing into wind. Especially if you're taking off heavy stuff, you need the wind. The Outeniqua, of course, has got those 2 masts. Now, the first time that I went there, I was just looking from the bridge, and all you can see are the 2 masts like this.
And really, you're talking about very, very small gaps, actually.
I was standing there looking up at this thing to see how much leeway there is on each side, and there isn't a lot of leeway for making mistakes.
That was impressive, because it meant that the helicopter had to maneuver over the hatch cover where the load was waiting, and then go into a hover just above deck. And you've got your clearance for the rotor blades between the superstructure and the crane, only a few meters.
Every load has a different configuration and therefore a different speed that you could fly. We would have a look at what it was. They would normally tell us more or less what it weighed, and so we would know more or less what it would do. Light ones can cause their own problems because they start flying and they start doing things underneath the aircraft. It could cause the whole aircraft to get out of control, and then you'd have to throw things away, which you don't want to do. You don't want to lose things. The flight engineer is lying and looking down below you, and he will be obviously talking to the pilots continuously, telling them what the load was doing, and we would adjust our speed accordingly.
You've really got to be a professional to be able to do that repeatedly, safely, and in some of the worst weather as well.
However, as the helicopters can only handle a maximum payload of about 2 tons, and some of the equipment is in excess of 20 tons, the only option is for the ship's cargo cranes to be used.
Die walhuis dink ek nou is tussen 45 en 50 meter hoog.
As I recall, the ice wall was anything up to 45 or 50 meters high. As a result, the ship's crane couldn't be used to offload the cargo directly onto the shelf. It's simply too high. And there were vehicles weighing some 23 tons and 25,000 litre fuel tankers that needed to be offloaded.
The construction of the ramp was another hair-raising activity. Basically, they just had to push snow until they pushed it over the edge. And then below them, they've got sea. If the snow broke away, at the edge of the shelf. Somehow I have no doubts that we've necessarily been able to stop the dozer from plummeting into the sea.
Hy kan enige oomblik meegee.
It can give way at any moment. You'll never know when.
Toe ek feitelik
Once, when I'd almost reached the point where the snow fell into the sea, I was about 10 meters from the edge. For some reason, and I really can't explain it, the edge of the whole shelf just collapsed. All I could do is sit and watch as the ice shelf completely collapsed all around me. And I could see for kilometers down the ice shelf to the left and the right of me. I just put the bulldozer in reverse and got out of there. It was a very dangerous situation, but it just wasn't my time.
my tyd gewees om te val nie.
With the ramp dug down low enough, the offloading begins. After the offloading has been completed, the sorted boxes of equipment and the accommodation units are put on large sleds and prepared for the 150-kilometer journey south over treacherous ice and snow to the site of the new base.
If I have to say that I have any unpleasant recollections of Antarctica, it would probably be the trip that I had to make overland in a container on a sled, towed by a Challenger.
Tussen 3 en 4 persone.
3 or 4 people can sit in that vehicle. It's pretty uncomfortable. You can either sit or lie down, but you can't really change position. It carries on like that for about 10 hours before you have an opportunity to stretch your legs.
'n bietjie bene te kan rek.
With the caterpillars only capable of reaching speeds of around 10 kilometers per hour on a good day, the 150-kilometer journey takes anything from 20 to 30 hours of continuous travel, depending on the load.
The containers were unheated. That was the first problem. The second thing was they had no windows. So once you closed the door, it was pitch dark. The third problem was that you're traversing a snow field filled with what they call sastrugi. The sastrugi are formed by the prevailing wind. So it's like being towed across a gigantic washboard for hour after hour after hour.
Despite the tedium and discomfort, the teams and drivers need to stay alert because real danger lurks just underfoot.
Crevasses occur wherever the ice is put under strain or stress, and that's usually because of the rock underneath the ice. Particularly, for example, if a rock is on a convex slope, then obviously the ice has to stretch over that slope, and at that point you will open up crevasses. So it's put under strain, and eventually the ice just shears. But then as snow blows over it during the gales, that builds up cornices on either edge, and then they join up.
It's quite easy. You can walk over one and not even know it's there. And then when you dig it open, then you realize actually what you've walked across.
When it's just a hazy, cloudy day, where top and bottom and everywhere looks the same, white, then you don't have any perception of depth. So you'll walk right over that, and usually it's about 10, 15 meters across, it could be 1 meter across. So depending on your weight and what happens and how strong and the temperature. If it's a very hot day, the snow obviously loses strength and then you'll go right through.
And then basically, because you've got this tractor train with linked vehicles, yes, it's always possible that a bridge will collapse.
After a 2-day trip, the team finally arrive at the site of the new base, the Nunatak Faceless Carpet, scouted and selected by Henny and his team a few years prior. While the offloading begins, a temporary construction camp must also be established. This will be home to the construction teams for the next 4 years, and it must be strong enough to withstand the frequent and unannounced Antarctic storms and their 200-kilometer-an-hour winds. The accommodation and other containers are placed at roughly 5-meter distances from one another. This is to prevent snow buildup around the buildings during storms. Once the team has established the temporary base, they are ready, after years of preparation and planning, to take the first steps in turning the vision into a reality. The construction of Sanai 4 begins.
The parameters that we had to work with, we had a reasonably flat, rocky surface, which in the end turned out not to be so flat because it had big boulders varying from 2-meter diameter to about 1 or 2 millimeter diameter. The hardcore work was drilling into the ice network. And it's a mixture of loose, broken rock that's caused by the freezing and thawing. So it's a very shattered top layers. So we found at about 1.5 meters, the rock started getting solid. We drilled 366 holes and then found all these steel tubes on which the structure was eventually assembled. To hold this down, each one of these poles had 4 smaller holes of about 50 millimeter diameter rock anchors. It was also drilled between 2 and 3 meters deep. Then there was a assembly plate on top of these, tied down and welded down. The next step was the subframes, which was bolted and welded onto this platform that you've created. And then up to the belly of the base. When it reaches minus 50, it's difficult to use any type of steel because it might become brittle and it might fracture. So all the steel work at the base was then a grade 300 WA, but it had gold properties, and we were quite happy that it would be sufficient for our purposes. So that was a tricky design to make sure that the foundation stays as solid as a rock.
By the end of February, the Antarctic summer is over, and winter conditions in Antarctica are extreme. Week upon week of complete darkness, winds frequently in excess of 200 kilometers an hour, and temperatures dropping to the minus 30s and 40s, and in some places lower. No construction can continue under these conditions. Furthermore, the teams must depart for Cape Town before the ships become locked in by the ice. In August, the sun will reappear, the pack ice will begin its retreat, and the construction teams will be able to return to pick up where they left off. This is the interrupted construction pattern for the next 4 years. Each year, before construction work on the new base can begin, the teams must first uncover what the winter storms and their ferocious winds have buried. Everything is under several meters of snow and ice. The underlying structure, which stands at roughly 4 meters off the ground, has been completed, so the bottom cladding of the new base can begin.
You know, it's also difficult to work without scaffolding. So, but if you do scaffolding, you know, and you have a windstorm and a snowstorm, then it will also just create a lot of havoc and snow accumulation around the areas. So what we decided was that the building will be built from the inside outwards. So once you had the bottom steel structure in place, you placed the outside skins of the belly first, and that created actually the working platform. And everything was lifted up onto that surface, and then from there on we built upwards again, so people were safe and there was no risk of falling off scaffolding or structures like that, especially if you're working in the wind.
Petrus Gildenaes was one of the environmental officers commissioned by SANAP during the construction period to oversee and implement compliance with the Madrid Protocol signed in 1991.
On the Nunatak, life was limited to a couple of lichen species and some microorganisms. So why the importance of environmental management on this side? And the answer can be found in 2 reasons. The one, you work in an environment where even biodegradable materials or wastes do not degrade easily, because it's the world's largest fridge. Even an apple core that you drop down may even be found in a year's time, still lying there frozen. Secondly, you can imagine on any construction site you have a variety of hazardous materials you work with, hydrocarbons, there's fuel, there's oils, there are resins. So spillages could be quite large, and the impact on the very limited life could be very severe on the Nunatak itself. When you get a call on the radio from someone who had an accidental spill of a couple of liters of oil on the snow, and we would rush down with our snow melter, spade all the dirty snow into the drum, melt it up and put it in a container for bringing it back to South Africa.
Towards the middle of the new base construction phase, the old South African base, Sanai 3, has become very difficult to live and work in, threatening the research underway. Virtually no part of the structure is secure.
One would often think that under these immense pressures, the structure could be crushed instantly.
One of the most disconcerting things that I can remember was waking up in the middle of the night and hearing a rivet popping. You heard this like a rifle shot.
Keeping up the pace of construction on the new base, Senai 4, was becoming increasingly important. However, attention to detail and ensuring that everything was done to best meet the original design and brief was paramount.
We went through a design review process, had a look at different material options. Obviously it freezes there, so it's very difficult if you want to use brick and mortar or anything like that. It's just not possible there. And we started looking at composites, which is glass reinforced plastic. GRP it's an amazing material. The polyester resins that we used there, we tested up to minus 250. In fact, the strength increased. It's a very versatile product for cold applications, and it will last at least the 25 years that we anticipate the base to last. The next step was the top steel frames, and the internal double story and first floor was also assembled on the inside, and eventually the panels were built around the steel structure and clad closed and insulated.
Alongside the new Sanai base is a project initiated by the British Antarctic Survey, the Southern Hemisphere Auroral Radar Experiment, or SHARE, which aims to track the effects of solar activity in the upper atmosphere.
We have this international radar network with some 10 radars in the Arctic and now nearly 7 radars in the Antarctic. Each of those radars surveys about 3 million square kilometres of the sky, but we need to get a complete circumpolar view. And again, that's beyond any one nation really to put in that many radars. Antarctica is a fantastic example of many, many nations, I mean at least 44 who are part of the Antarctic Treaty System, collaborating together. We kind of have to do it. Antarctica is vast. You know, it's a continent the size of Europe, and yet, for example, we've only got 25 permanent meteorological stations. So to achieve the data coverage you need requires collaboration. No one nation, even the most powerful, have got enough resources to capture all that we need from Antarctica in the way of scientific data.
Mike Pinnock joined the South African team to help put into commission their section of the International Radar Network.
Flying into Sanai was really exciting. You've got the vastness of Antarctica there, and then this piece of rock coming up through the ice, and then this base sat on top of it. It was quite an astonishing thing. The plane landed and we got out, and I think it was Henny and a group of others that were there to sort of shake our hands and meet and greet us.
We also had to erect radar antennas for one of the science programs, and that's where we met Mike Pinnock from BAS, one a very hefty season.
He gave us some critical advice as well, I have to say, on our radio masts. And the moment the team there had got them up, he looked at them and he said, "They ain't going to survive here."
We had already experienced 180 km/h winds, and we had to look at the design and we thought, sure, we're not quite sure we're gonna make it here because it's really extreme.
And sadly, he was proved to be right. Several of the masts did collapse in the first year, and I believe then Henny led a redesign effort in South Africa and came up with a far superior design. So, as an engineer, I have huge respect for him as well. Antarctica is only ever achieved by teamwork. We kind of have to learn from the penguins. It's only by the penguins huddling together that they can, the emperor penguins, that they can survive the Antarctic winter. It's how you behave. So teamwork is a key feature of Antarctic work.
There were teams up to 40, 50 men in an area that you had to manage for long hours, getting tired. It was a varied bunch of strong guys that we initially got over the years. It took a couple of years to construct this base, and for that you really needed guys that are strong in mind in terms of being exposed continually to this type of cold weather, and it's hard physical labor. People are working hard, they're getting tired, working 16, 18 hours per day, 7 days a week.
Things were still they were really demanding. They were quite tough at Sanai 4. They were working a very long shift system. I arrived at the stage where they'd got the building shell up and they'd done quite a lot of the fitting out. The people I was working with had got the radio masts erected and the antennae up, and they got all the equipment in situ, and it was really getting close to the stage of switching on the radar. We switched on and there it all was. It was working. It was great moment. In the mountain regions, and Sanai of course is close to the mountains, you get these katabatic winds, which are very, very fierce winds. I mean, often going over 100 knots and springing up very suddenly. They're downflows of cold air from the high plateau being channeled down through glaciated valleys. So just literally in a matter of minutes, you can go from moderate winds to really extreme winds.
It can be the most beautiful day. You can walk around in a t-shirt, the sun is shining, the skies are blue, and then suddenly you get this storm. This absolutely devastating storm. If you go walk outside for 10 minutes, you're dead.
Up until then, I had never seen the sea in that area as being anything except mill pond calm. And now we were seeing swells and waves and white horses and that sort of thing. The weather was unpleasant. It had become very overcast and there was a wind blowing. But it wasn't that bad. And we thought, well, we'll go up to the bridge top of the Antarctica and just try and get some atmospheric shots. And I can remember that we heard a noise, and suddenly the ship heeled over and we were hit by a solid wall of air. And all we could think of was just getting the camera off the tripod and sitting down where we were, because we couldn't believe what was actually happening. And from then on, the weather just got progressively worse.
We actually got stuck in the building that hadn't finished being completed, but we were ordered by Henny and his crew to stay there rather than try and travel the 600 metres or so back to the field camp. And that was a good decision. It was entirely the right thing to do.
And then they made an announcement that they could confirm that there were 4 people unaccounted for.
The wind was so strong that night that the wind meter, the thermometer, measuring the wind speeds, got stuck at about 190 something kilometers per hour. And I guess the wind speeds went closer to 200 that night.
And then they reported that they'd found, I think there were 2 guys out in one of the Caterpillar tractors that they'd got back. They'd reported in, so it was done. Eventually, there's 1 guy missing.
The question is always, how long do you wait till you go looking for him?
The worst of it is that they didn't identify who it was. They didn't know at that stage who it was. And you think about your friends, the people that you actually know, that are ashore. And you think, well, I hope it's not so-and-so, I hope it's not so-and-so. And you also realize that as you're saying that, you're condemning somebody else.
When you get up to conditions, much in excess of 40 knots, then you want to look very, very carefully at whether it really is necessary to get out there, or whether it's better to wait.
Yeah, how long do you wait? And unfortunately for us, we went out after about 15 minutes or so, which we thought was a reasonable time. And so 3 of us went out, moving along the road towards my hut, because that was the area where the guy got lost. And that was a 5-meter distance that we had to cover. We started moving along the rope, the 3 of us, me in the front, with Pierre right behind me, and the doctor also just right behind him. And we started moving across this 5-meter span. And we were like right in the middle of it when it was the last time that I turned around and I saw that Pierre was still with me. I couldn't see the doctor at the time. I didn't know that he wasn't, in the meantime, turned around. Miraculously, the first person that got lost, which was the reason why we went out on the search, came across the base again by accident, and he made his way back. In the meantime, I had to move just the last 2 meters to get to the hut. And when I crossed that, I turned around and Pierre was gone. He wasn't behind me anymore. My immediate assumptions that he also decided to turn around. It's only when I moved back a couple of minutes later, moved back with the rope towards the catwalk where it was fastened on the other side, that I realized that Pierre didn't go back. So, and it's only then that we realized that he lost grip of the rope for a moment, and that one moment that you cannot lose the rope, and he was taken off the rope by the wind.
He had then obviously been blown quite away, but about 100, 200 meters away was the cliff edge where we were building.
The wind was so strong that he couldn't even crawl against the push of the wind. The ice conditions under such stormy conditions and at such low temperatures, on that night the temperature went down to -23, the snow is very hard and you can't get a grip on it. There's nothing to hold on to. So if the wind pushes you on all fours, there's just nothing to hold on to.
There's just no, you can see as far as your hand go. It's just white all over the place. So you get disorientated very quickly.
He was missing for, if I remember correctly, 43 hours or so. And that was as long as it took for the storm to abate to a point where they could actually go out and find him. The conditions were still appalling at that point. And they had already tried, but obviously you can't risk more lives in trying to find somebody under those conditions.
You can't really see anything, so they would take a rope of about 20 meters and everybody would be linked onto this rope, and they would make little search circles of 20 meter radius from the base, so they can tie a rope on there, and then swept, and they just couldn't find him. You just really can't see. And if you try to open up your goggles or something, the wind just blows in and freezes your eyelids together. About 4 days later, when the storm subsided, they found Pierre about 40 meters away from the base.
With his full Antarctic dress, but still not enough to have protected him from the conditions.
It really came home that even with your 7 layers of clothing and all the rest, was no protection really. And that you're really in a place where the forces of nature are far stronger than you can imagine.
It made us all aware of our vulnerability in this environment, the unforgiving nature of the environment there.
When there's something like this happens, it's not easy to carry on. But in the end, we had a goal. We had to complete the base, and it is one of those unfortunate things in life that you had to carry on and complete what you came there for.
The devastating storm not only claims the life of a team member, but leaves the crew with the task of uncovering and finding everything again. The driven snow has got in everywhere. Despite the setbacks and losses, the team focused their energies to bring the building of the base to completion. The final tally of materials used is staggering. 25 tons of nuts and bolts, 600 tons of structural steel, 11,000 square meters of glass wool insulation, 4 kilometers of optical fiber, 9 kilometers of electrical cabling, over 23 kilometers of neoprene rubber and silicon seals, and over 130 tons of kitchen, firefighting, water supply and sewerage equipment. The building is completed, and the empty shell of the new base has become a home. The completed base draws in scientists from South Africa and around the world, eager to begin the myriad of vital scientific projects. The building of one of the world's most advanced research stations in Antarctica, an impressive monument to human ingenuity and to South Africa's commitment to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, has captured the imagination of the British Antarctic Survey.
We are just in the process of building a new station at Halley, and it's a very exciting concept. For the first time, this is going to be a station that is not only is on the surface on legs, but the legs are mounted on skis, and this is a relocatable base. We can move the base. Because the ice shelf is flowing like a glacier, we have to continually be moving upstream, perhaps every 5-10 years. A South African consortium, which Henny is leading, was successful in bidding for supplying most of the structure, the steelwork and the cladding of the base. So his continuing involvement in Antarctic stations is, at the moment, is happening through us building Halley Station.
Antarctica is in equal measures both inhospitable and wondrous.
For me now, Antarctica is a second home, a home from home.
It's a very intense experience. It's a vast expanse of nothing, and yet there's so much detail in that nothing, and that is fascinating.
14 months passed in a moment. It was really worth every minute.
We had very good times and very difficult times together in those 6 construction seasons.
If you've had anything of a positive experience down there, I think you'd want to go back.
It's just in my blood. I think it's bitten me, and I really long to get back there again, like I did for 17 times.
To me, that's summed up by something that Nelson Mandela actually said. He said that if you go back to a place that's familiar, then you start discovering what has changed about yourself.
No doubt, many see their journey down to Antarctica as a personal adventure or as an opportunity to come to a deeper understanding of themselves and to test their own personal limits. However, their contribution, whether direct or indirect, to the vital and growing body of knowledge concerning our planet's past, and in turn its likely future, that is gathered in this place called Antarctica, is what makes them Ice World pioneers.